Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of SpeakUp Talks. Yeah, we're always thinking about new challenges in ethics, compliance, and integrity. And of course, one of the topics that we don't talk about as much, but is quite interesting, is the topic of conflict of interest. So Tim is back with us today, our CEO. Nice to have you again, Tim.
Yeah, happy to be here. So I'm excited to talk about conflicts of interest. I feel one of the topics that maybe doesn't get enough attention in the ethics and compliance world, but can be really complicated as well. One of those things at face value that seems simple. Run a disclosure program once a year and problem solved, but they can be really complex. So you run into everything from outside work, personal relationships, outside financial interests. And while there's often a lot of policies in place for how to deal with these, it's not always clear for the employee that they need to disclose something. A lot of times employees don't even know something they're doing is a conflict of interest. And then you run into all the challenges from a culture perspective. For different companies have different ways that they work, different freedoms they allow employees. So there's not always a standardized viewpoint of what conflicts are across different organizations, different countries, and so on. So it's a complicated task, but it's also a fun one.
Pervasive than, so to say, the whistleblowing topic that we normally talk about, where you say, this is wrong, you say something, and now we have a situation where the conflict may be a lot more unclear and undefined.
Exactly, and as we'll get into it, you often run into those two items even coming together. You have whistleblower speak-up programs where people are reporting on conflicts of interest, and then there's the disclosure program of conflicts of interest, and how do you marry these two things up? So it's permeates throughout the company.
Exactly, and whistleblowing conflict of interest is kind of a category of issues that could be at hand, but it's not the same as actually managing a conflict of interest program. And that's of course great to talk about how also technology can assist organizations in achieving a successful program. But maybe before we dive into that, let's get a little bit more clarification about what is a conflict of interest or the type of conflict of interest that we're talking about here.
Yeah, so a conflict can be, anything that could, influence professional decisions. So that could be anything ranging from, reporting line challenges of, hiring a relative to having, outside work activities. So that could be anything from, if you're at a tech company, you have your side project, or it could be you're sitting on the board and maybe they're slightly competitive, or a vendor you might have, a relationship with, financially or personally. And those are just a few of the examples. I've worked with companies that, they look at it, kind of narrow like this, and somewhere that list gets very broad. And a lot of times that goes to what freedoms do you allow your employees to even have? So it's, it definitely can get quite complicated. And then there's, is it really a conflict of perception, and how do you deal with these different things?
Yeah, because something can be a conflict, but can also just look like a conflict. And in the end, the conflict doesn't have to be a problem if you manage it right.
It's not that you want to stop things. It's being aware of it, building the right, mitigating measures and the right controls in place, ultimately to still be able to run the business and, be transparent and build trust with the organization.
And that's, of course, a challenge because I think one of the main challenges is how do you bring this to the attention of your employees in a structured manner, in an understandable manner, so that they first know that there is such a thing as a conflict of interest, but also that they know what to do when they see it or expect that they may have one.
What we've seen a lot of companies do is, do an annual disclosure program.
Just annually?
That's where people get started. And half the time I hear this is, SurveyMonkey and an Excel spreadsheet and, very exercise. And the problem with that is, it's once a year, things happen in the middle. But then also when you're rolling this out so infrequently, people just aren't aware of it. And again, people then have to think, what am I doing in my life? It has a conflict, and there's no proactive nature to that. And again, I think one of the biggest challenges, people just don't know the things they're doing might be a conflict of interest.
So it's also education, really about the topic itself, besides the awareness, because awareness you can create, of course, by sending out some emails, campaigning, stuff like that, or onboarding training. But the education and the thought process around is also a challenge.
Definitely. So, we've seen there's training programs, there's policies, but how do you being able to unify all of these together into, a holistic program?
Yeah.
Something that is often missed. And it's one thing when you walk through the process of really dealing with it and all the challenges that come into reconciling all this information and the time sink that goes into that, it can be quite frustrating for compliance officers to try to understand, someone had something, is it still a conflict today that it was earlier? Has that evolved? Has our business evolved? So
exactly.
Bigger companies do acquisitions, things change. So something that was true then, or maybe something disclosed that wasn't a problem, all of a sudden might be. And if you're doing all of that through spreadsheets or through siloed tools, a lot is going to fall through the cracks.
What can also help here is a way to proactively address certain group of employees, for example, in, particular area of business where you did such an acquisition, and address to those people again saying, hey, the world has changed with regards to how we operate. Can you reassess this? Is that a common thing that organizations
It should
do?
be, but you don't see it as often as you think. Most programs, when we talk out there, they're doing annual disclosure programs. They don't have an ad hoc disclosure program to combine with that. And if they do, often they're separated. So they might do the ad hoc in one place, the annual in another, and then how do you merge these things together? Often is missed. When we think of a best in class program, you're going to have all of those different mechanisms for reporting. There's going to be an annual program. You're going to have the ability for employees to come in and do those ad hoc. There's going to be a way for them to easily understand if the things they're doing are a conflict in a consumerized way. And then the ability to actually target certain audiences when changes in the business arise. So that could be a variety of factors that make what was true today different from tomorrow. And you want to be able to easily isolate those and deal with those specifically.
Yeah. And is it typical for organizations, say from an HR perspective, to take it into account as well, where people internally develop their careers into more influential positions, where this topic is readdressed as well?
One of the companies I've worked with who has one of the better programs I've seen, they run different programs for certain different employee audience. So if you're above being a VP, for example, there's a different process that needs to be followed than if you're an employee, maybe in a different group. And because the risk is different, as you get higher up in the organization, there's, you run into more of the financial type of risks that come with, being an executive. There's also the pre-hire part of it. So when you're onboarding new people, particularly executives, they may have holdings, they may have board appointments, they may have other outside activities, and that can be part of, hiring talent. So if there's you versus another company trying to hire the same person, your ability to understand those conflicts and deal with them quicker is going to put you in an advantage.
Yeah. So there's also perhaps some connectivity with political exposed persons as well, right?
100%.
That ties into this conflict of interest area.
Yeah, conflicts can just get so broad, and where do you draw the line on it? Oftentimes there's things like gifts and entertainment type programs. Sometimes those are split off, but they often fall under the general umbrella of conflicts of interest as well. And then who are those going to? And then, getting into political activity, and that can vary depending on countries throughout the world. So just creates all this complexity that needs to be dealt with.
So challenges for large multinationals, right? So what do you think is typical for an organization? Do they have more professionalized tooling in place for tracking this, or you reckon that most organizations are still based out of that Excel type of situation?
I think most right now still don't have focused tools on this. That's what we've seen. So it's getting better. But when you compare it to the adoption of tools like, having a SpeakUp program, having a third-party risk program, having a formal conflicts program that is well-tooled with something fit for purpose is much lower down the risk list. You still see a lot of homegrown. So that could be anything from Excel to using SharePoint to, as I mentioned, SurveyMonkey, something I've heard more than once. Those, work for parts of it, but they all have gaps and flaws that don't come together for, the holistic program, and being able to connect between all of the different things that fall under conflicts of interest, which again, that's coming from SpeakUp program, that could come from your third party program, that can come from your gifts and entertainment, so on and so forth. So really need to be able to connect the dots.
Somebody may be actually making a whistleblower report, maybe like an external supplier or something like that is reporting saying, hey, this particular person also has that particular relationship, that doesn't sound fair. If you have all your data connected, I understand it will be more easy to identify, did we know about that in advance? And if so, did we mitigate it or not?
Absolutely. And the mitigation part you mentioned is one of the parts that, again, when you're using these homegrown tools, I think most companies are doing mitigations, but can you actually track and report, and do you have the documentation of how you dealt with that? Because also when you think of the process, there's precedent involved in those decisions as well. So how do you use the decisioning you've done before to guide, people through that? Because one of the challenges with a lot of conflicts programs, and I'm sure all the compliance officers listening in, compliance officers are a small and mighty team that is serving a very big company. So often in conflicts programs, the first line of review is not in the compliance office, but might be with their line manager or someone within the business. So how are we enabling those people to make the right decisions as it relates to conflicts of interest, so that all the burden doesn't fall on a very small staff? So it's how do you empower the organization, and proper tooling is a great way to do that.
So within these kind of tools, there are also guidelines for line managers that they could rely on in making their initial assessment. And I think this is also kind of that balance which you mentioned with the gifts and entertainment policies, where there's kind of a budget limit from where another level of management is supposed to have an opinion about whether it's okay to receive certain gift, or whether the gift is actually now constituting conflict of interest.
This is the thing that's a lot different from, like a SpeakUp program to when you get into conflicts program, is the interaction with the business is much larger.
Yeah.
Compliance doesn't necessarily know if it's a conflict. They need to interact with different groups within the company. So as an example, if you're a big tech company, you allow your employees a lot of freedom to work side projects. Compliance is going to have no idea if there's something in R&D, there's a pending acquisition, there's some project that's being worked on that may be a conflict. So how do you, and their line manager might not know.
The employee will also probably not know.
So how do you deal with insecure channels, engage the right stakeholders to make a decision so things aren't flying around 1,000 emails? You're able to quickly bring the right people in, able to understand, and able to deal with that in a way that's, has the right people involved, and also provides clarity to the person who's, trying to move forward with their business activities. Yeah. So there's the whole speed element to this as well of, you want to be able to resolve these things as quickly as possible. And if you're trying to just maneuver between a bunch of different areas, it's going to take a lot more time, and it's going to provide a lack of clarity.
Yeah. So that's very insightful. And I think what I hear from you is you have quite a view on how things should be. And so from a technology perspective, and of course, technologies like AI, what do you see for the future?
AI is going to be very interesting in conflicts, in how it interacts more broadly as well. So for one, conflicts is one of those areas where there is that upfront lack of clarity. So rather than everyone going in and submitting something, there's that pre-triage step of just being able to ask, hey, I'm doing this. Is this in policy or not? Is this something that I should disclose or report or not? Which can help also on the compliance manager side. If there's things that are out of scope, those things are dealt with before they even get in there. But then you're also providing the employee that right level of guidance. So that's that first part. But then as things start to come in, you're getting data on the conflicts. So AI can be used for spotting patterns, helping with, deciding precedent, providing guidance to those managers as they're in the process of how should we deal with this in that particular case. So there's a ton of applications where AI can really help people deal with these conflicts of interest, both for the employee to make their lives easier, but also for the compliance teams.
So it sounds to me that these technologies that we speak about can really contribute to the conflict of interest area, and basically all the steps that we spoke about can be in the area of awareness, can be in the area of training, but also in the area of actually dealing with these in an effective manner, and bringing all the information together in one place for future reference.
The trend is going to continue that people tool these, and the overlap with other programs is significant. So when people look at tooling, being able to combine it with data like from their SpeakUp program or other parts of their organization, so you have that view of what are the different activities going on, and you're able to easily close things out or connect the dots between different areas and understand where your risk truly is. So that's the trend that we see, and that's going to continue to be adopted throughout. It always starts with the bigger companies, but ultimately, and over the coming years, more and more of these programs are going to be deployed.
Thank you, Tim, for your time today and all your insights into what the future may hold. And audience, thank you as well. If you want to see more information on the interesting resources we have, please check out the website and hope to see you at the next SpeakUp Talks.